We may have a few more join us, but I think we should get started. Just any comments or questions from any of this is the last session for this particular adult forum. And any comments, questions, anything that's on your mind or something you've noticed in the news? We certainly have issues going on that.
CNN, Doomsday Glacier.
Oh.
It could raise sea level by several feet. It's holding on by its fingernails.
Which is it, Antarctica or Greenland? Yeah, Greenland's a problem too, because
So-called Doomsday Glacier, nicknamed because of its high risk of collapse and threat to global sea levels, has the potential to rapidly retreat in the coming years.
yeah, so just glaciers melting. We've talked about for some time now about we may have a national park named Glacier National Park with no glaciers, which is, boy, isn't that that's like, it's at least ironic, I guess, but it's just sad is what it is. Now, things change. It's not, at times, but when we're so involved in helping bring this along or move this along, that's where the concern is. Anything else? I was just there. That's where our bishop's convo was, at the Best Western at Agate Beach. Did not find any agates, but I did see a heron, and I think I'm gonna write about the heron in my grace note on Tuesday. So I had something there to notice, but yeah, I didn't even realize that there's no agates at Agate Beach. Yeah, snow crabs too. Yeah. So a lot of signs, and again, this isn't the first time in history, obviously, where we've had major changes, but where our behavior as human beings has been so so much a part of why we're dealing with some of the stuff we're dealing with now. Although that's still, I do know of people who will acknowledge that there's climate change, but they still don't accept that human beings are responsible for it. I think that's getting harder to maintain. And there's even I wish I could remember his name. He was down in North Carolina, I think, or South Carolina, Republican representative who is trying to organize some young representatives because he takes climate change seriously, even though he's a Republican. I grew up, Tom McCall and Richard Nixon were in power, and that's when we had some of our major environmental laws were passed, both in the state and then nationally, back with Republicans in power. So it's. So he wasn't perfect, but he had to have some Republican support to pass it, obviously. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't going to pass without that. So.
Well, they say that the Earth will still persist. We may not.
Yeah, that's the challenge. Yeah. All right. I did bring. I'm not promoting. I just want you to know I've got 4 copies of the book I wrote, because back when it first came out, people bought a lot of copies. Your pastor's producing a book. You take a look at it at least. But it's there if you're interested. And all we have is a designated fund for that book. And if you want to make a contribution toward that designated fund, you just, I think we were just saying $20, but I think it actually costs $15 approximately per copy for the church to get them. So they're there. And if you want to take a copy, and you don't have to, at this point, we want people to read it. So it's there. I mean, a couple of the top 2, I also put a little sign something in there for you if you want that. All right, well, let's dive in then to Coming Home to Earth. So this is the short version of what I write more extensively in Coming Home to Earth. It's been 6 years since that came out, so a lot has happened since then. And there are more ideas. There's more concern and involvement than there was at the time when it came out. It came out about a month after Pope Francis put out Laudato Si, his encyclical on this. if I'd have been named Pope Francis, we could have paid off the mortgage so quickly if we'd have just, because that would have been a bestseller, if you've got the right name and you're the right person. But in any case, I'm just glad that we had a Pope who was willing to address something like this. I think that was very important, and especially with how the Pope is known throughout the world, whether people agree with the Pope or the Catholic Church on everything, to have the Pope write on that particular issue and do it in a relatively condensed fashion. It was not a long book that he put out. It made it accessible, so I was glad to see that. So for priming the pump, a couple of questions. What keeps human beings from adopting a sustainable way of life? And what do you think is the church's primary responsibility in addressing climate change and other ecological issues? One of the reasons I wrote this book was I was very concerned about, I'm not the scientific expert, but what will actually motivate people to change? And that could apply to other issues too, besides this one. But what do you think keeps us from adopting a sustainable way of life? What do you think is church's primary responsibility? And again, we're priming the pump here. So go ahead and spend a few minutes at your tables talking about it. Give you another minute or two. So the Lord be with you. Thank you. It sounded like there was conversation going at each of your tables. I always hate to interrupt it, but we need to move on. So let me, as part of priming the pump, share a passage from Coming Home to Earth, the parable called the Parable of the Prodigal Species. Okay, so our first part, well, just a brief remembrance of the parable of the prodigal son, and then you'll see the tie-in. So in the parable of the prodigal son, the youngest son asked for his share of the family inheritance, gathered all his belongings, and left home. He traveled to a distant land, and free to do whatever he wanted with what he had, he squandered his inheritance in dissolute living. That word dissolute, doesn't that just sound like it's a perfect word for what he was doing? When a severe famine set in, he began to experience hunger. In desperation, he hired himself out as a field hand to feed pigs. Since the Jews considered pigs to be unclean, working with pigs represented a real fall. It was as low as he could go. He was so hungry himself that he would have gladly eaten the pods he was feeding the pigs. Finally, he came to his senses and realized his father's field hands were living better than he was. He knew he had no right to live as his father's son, but he resolved to confess the error of his ways and ask his father to hire him as a field hand. As the story goes, his father saw him coming while he was still a long way off. Filled with compassion, the father ran, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. Even as the son tried to confess his sins, the father began planning a party to celebrate the return of his beloved boy. He exclaimed, "This son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." Like the prodigal son, we humans have been given our share of the family inheritance. That is a portion of our earth home. And like the prodigal son, we have imposed exile on ourselves and engaged in extravagant, wasteful living. In fact, our prodigality has surpassed that of the indulgent son. We have squandered more than our fair share of our earth home, and other creatures have had to pay the price. As was the father in the parable, God is eagerly waiting for us to come home. Will we, the prodigal species, come to our senses before it is too late? Will we come home and care for our earth community in such a way that all humankind and other kind can thrive? There's a quotation, I didn't include it in the outline, but a quotation from Wendell Berry, who was an English professor and lived also in agriculture, lived on a family farm in Kentucky, written a number of books, and was one of my most helpful resources when I was working on the book. But he has this line, "No sane creature befouls its own nest." No sane creature befouls its own nest. You can see that one just stuck with me, that idea. But it makes no sense in one way. But it's hard for us to wake up. There is a need for an eco-reformation of the church. We're talking about what's needed in the society and world as a whole, but certainly in the church, there has been such a need. The Reformation principle, I actually mentioned it in the sermon today. If you were at the 8:30 service, the Latin is Ecclesia Semper Reformanda Est, but it means the church is always reforming, or another variation that I talked about in the sermon was actually the church is always being reformed. So there's a sense that God is active in that, and then we're participating. The hope is that we can participate in what we think God is up to. This eco-reformation has begun at St. Andrew, and there's really been things going on for a number of years at St. Andrew. Earth care is a core value. That's certainly, I don't know how excited people were about that when we first introduced it as a core value, but it's certainly something that I think for the most part, if people have been around here, they're aware that that's one of our core values, and we certainly have the Earth Care team is one of the teams that continues to be most active in terms of engaging in various activities in ministry. In terms of facility project measures, and some of this happened with the facility project, where we're sitting here. A big part of that facility project was doing certain things. So, for example, wetland mitigation, our parking lot here just extended far enough and encroaching on the wetland, not so much directly, but just the runoff, that we had to plant over 2,000 trees and bushes back as part of the facility project. Eric Luttrell and Don Nearhood, and then Pauline Sekas. The three of them literally mapped out where we were going to plant over 2,000 bushes and plants. Amazing project. And then I still remember we had like 60 or 70 different people help with that, and that was intergenerational. You know, it was great to see people of all ages participating in doing that mitigation.
Clean Water Services has added probably that many again.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. Yeah, since then. So they clean water. So we've been partnering within the congregation, but then with community groups too. So that's how these things tend to work best, when you can have partnerships like that. Rain gardens, we have a number of them on the property, and I still remember there's big, huge, I think they're 500 gallons each. There's two of them. They're under the parking lot back here, and that's where water from the rain gardens goes in there, and then it's filtered before it goes out from here. So that's another project. Community garden, we had one before the facility project, but it got done in a more structured way now with once we had that project. The chapel flooring, so if you go into the chapel, the flooring there used to be the flooring basically in that half of the fellowship hall was where the old sanctuary was, and so the hardwood from that was removed by people from the church. We did get somebody who knew it, was a little more experienced to install it, and which was a smart move. Our people here can do a lot of good things, but that was a good project to get some help on. But that was another part of it. And then also actually some of the stained glass windows from the old sanctuary ended up, so the window to the right in the chapel, you'll see much, about 80% of that is stained glass from these stained glass windows in the old sanctuary. So just, again, various examples. We didn't win any awards when we built the new facility, no platinum awards or anything like that, but some real common sense things were done. Since then, solar panels have been added. We did know when we did the facility project that we had the perfect southern exposure roof for solar panels. It just took us a while before we finally got them installed. And soil gardens, that was a big project the Earth Care team was involved in several years ago, in going around evaluating people's yards and encouraging them to put in soil gardens. And then this last April, big Earth Care Fair, that seemed to be a success, and I know plans are being made to do that again this coming April, kind of in conjunction about the time when Earth Day is observed here in the country. So.
And backyard habitats.
Oh, I didn't. Yeah, I actually work. Yes, I missed that. Thank you. An Earth Camp. Yes. So this is ancient history here. No, Earth Camp has really caught on. That's been. I was talking to Suzanne Warrens, who sadly is getting toward the end here, but she could still talk with me. And her daughter, Colleen Warrens, who died during the pandemic, really liked, and she was in a wheelchair, had some real difficult physical challenges, but she loved drama camp. Well, Earth Camp's also filled that, because we don't have a drama camp anymore, but the Earth Camp is something special for the children, and it's the team of people also helping make it happen makes it special. But yeah, Earth Camp, and then the backyard habitat thing, we got the platinum, like the highest level for that. So that was pretty cool when I heard that. Discussions with climate change skeptics. And I had a discussion like this a number of years ago where I said, what if there's just a 10% chance that what's being said about climate change is accurate? I said, even for 10% chance, wouldn't it be worth taking steps to try to alleviate what might happen to our children and grandchildren, even if it's just a 10% chance that it's true? Which is kind of like the insurance argument, is why I put that there, where you're, you hope you don't like to get in, we don't like to get in accidents, obviously, although they're very common with automobiles and homes. You don't want to have accidents, but that's why you have insurance. And so we buy insurance, even though there may be a good chance, well, nothing will ever happen to our home that we have to get insurance for. What if there's a 10% chance? And I'm not sure I changed his mind about it, but I think it gave him something to think about. I just appreciate too, though, that he remained a member of the congregation, even though he had some serious issues with some of the political views in his mind that he was hearing here. He's stayed with the congregation, appreciate that. And he did send me a little article. I'm not going to name him, not that he would care. He's not afraid to say what's on his mind. But he sent me a little article then about, you just mentioned the glacier, in Antarctica, but this was about from Patagonia. And it was a little article about maybe things were melting there faster than normal. And he said, well, you might be telling the truth, he said. So again, this is serious stuff, but I also think we have to have a little bit of humor about it as we go through this too. When overwhelming things often can be dealt with if we have a little bit of humor about some of it. The major obstacle, at least one major obstacle, if not the major obstacle, is are we willing to sacrifice an unsustainable way of life that we hold dear? And I think that's actually an issue, not just for the opponents of climate change. I think that's an issue for proponents who are willing to recognize there's an issue. But when you talk about actually doing some of the things that need to be done to truly address this, that is can be a major difficulty. The one, I think World War II and the kind of rationing that was done during World War II, and you had victory gardens and stuff like that, is an example of the kind of adjustments people may need to make, maybe even more to actually deal with it. And people really did make major sacrifices during World War II to win that war. And that's, Liz, go ahead. Yeah, Inconvenient. Yeah, Inconvenient Truth was that video that came out. That actually came out about when I came to St. Andrew. It was about that same time. And we did show it here. Yeah, we had one of the initial viewings of it. No, that's exactly right. So, central question, what would motivate people? In the last chapter, I lift up 7 motivations for addressing climate change. Let me go through those. So the first is gloom and doom, ecological hell, fire, and brimstone preaching. It's also known as scaring the hell out of us. That's one approach to motivating people. There is a danger of pressing the fear and guilt button over and over again because people finally may just give up. It's just, woe is us. What I do isn't that much, and it just seems like we're not making any progress on it, and so we can just give up. There obviously is a point, though, you've got to alert people to what are we actually dealing with here. So there's some wisdom in this, but in itself, it's not going to be enough. The appeal to human self-interest. We need to help people see that our own well-being is connected with the well-being of other creatures. There is a danger, I think, for some time to insist on pure motives. If somebody's willing to make changes based on self-interest, fine. I mean, at this point, we've got to be a little more open to what, if people can see it from that angle, fine, because we're in a culture where we tend to be an individualistic culture. That's what we're known for. And so appealing to self-interest, it's how politicians often get elected, is appealing to self-interest, economic self-interest. That can sometimes overwhelm a lot of other interests. So self-interest may be something we need to work with to a certain extent. And notice in the second greatest commandment, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love of self is the starting point. So what if you truly love yourself, even if we can help people see how connected we are, our well-being with the well-being of others, that can be a possible motivation. Ecological enlightenment or consciousness raising. This is where if we just educate people enough, and certainly we need education on these things. I mean, I'm sitting here teaching, so that's obviously one of the motivations is that. There's the Earth Charter Initiative that from a while back which was an effort, UN encouraged this, but it was to really look at this and get people to sign on to an Earth Charter. We've had the various gatherings now where they gather people from around the world gather. We've tried to reach some agreements on climate issues. So that's in effect kind of continues what started out as the Earth Charter initiative. It is important to be as well informed as possible, but knowledge in itself is not enough to move people. And I've seen various studies, not just related to this, about how when push comes to shove, emotions often drive what people do even more than just thinking the right things. It's how are people feeling about what's going on. There's an appeal to an emerging story of the universe. Just understanding who we are in relationship to the universe can give us perspective. Universities can provide leadership for us in helping us see who we are in relationship to the universe. Somebody who's actually worked on this quite a bit in terms of the story of the universe is Ruth Nicodemus. And Ruth Nicodemus is a member of St. Andrew. I don't know if you've ever had a chance to hear her tell the story of the universe, but it's pretty interesting when she does it. Thomas Berry is the thinker who wrote the most about this. But again, just being aware of who we actually are in relationship to the whole of things. Number 5 then, going to the back page, take future generations into account. In indigenous traditions, they talk about 7th generation thinking. So it's not just what's happening now, but how is this going to impact future generations? And so we'll talk about 7 generations. In the Bible, 7 is kind of the number of completeness. So there's something about that number 7. I mean, I suppose you could say 8th generation thinking, but it's thinking about the future. And James Hansen has written a book called Storms of My Grandchildren. He's been one of the foremost voices speaking before Congress. President Obama really looked to him for expertise. He worked for NASA for a time. They didn't necessarily like all the conclusions he was coming to, but he actually originally was at the University of Iowa. So Carol Harker, our parish manager, knows him personally. It's always nice to hear about somebody who is known personally by somebody that we know and trust. So he's a very intelligent, down-home guy from Iowa is what he is. But he's written this book called Storms of My Grandchildren, and that really was motivating for him, is what he could see happening from his studies to his children and grandchildren. Not clear, though, if this is enough, because even though all of us would say, yeah, we love our grandchildren, when push comes to shove and it comes to making daily decisions about our lifestyles, that in itself may not be enough. Number 6 is rediscover the joy and wonder of nature. And if you love something, that can sometimes motivate us to do things when we actually love and care for someone or something. Oregonians, I think, can relate to this. It's a little harder when you're in a place like I was in Illinois for many years, and the closest thing to a wilderness area in Illinois was the backwaters of the Mississippi. That really felt, when I went in on a boat one time into the backwaters of the Mississippi, that felt like wilderness. But everything's developed there is what it feels like. It doesn't mean there aren't beautiful places and there's trees and everything else, but it's just, here we are blessed with having what a variety of places to just go and visit or just watch things. We can hike, and you've got ocean, you got mountains, you got high desert, got the valley, Multnomah Falls and the gorge. I mean, there's just a lot of opportunities. And I think Oregonians, those who are born here in Oregon and have lived here, can kind of take it for granted. They don't realize this is a pretty amazing place to live in that way. But that's the whole idea, is rediscovering the joy and wonder of nature and cultivating praise and thanksgiving for all of that. And I think the difficulty with this, though, is a guy named Richard Liu, and I should have put the footnote here, but he talks about a nature deficit disorder, and his project has been to get children back into the woods. That's his goal. Last Child in the Woods is the book he's written. But even it seems like we're dealing with something more just than nature deficit disorder. So just getting people in, that's a good thing, but I don't think it's enough in and of itself. And the final one, to be grasped by God's unconditional love. And so we can't just conjure up love of the earth. We need to be grasped by God's love and God's love for all creation and for our earth home and all its inhabitants. And so we can participate in God's love by sharing in God's delight. When God created everything, it says God, in effect, it says God delighted in it. God delighted in what God had made. We can also grieve with God about what's been happening to our earth home. That can motivate us to sacrifice ourselves for our fellow human beings and fellow creatures. And the key thing here is, if we just pursue human well-being in a narrow sense, we're not going to see this. I mean, you've got to look to the well-being of what's a thriving earth community in a holistic way. Gretchen.
What has been done about studying what's the cost, the actual monetary cost, if we keep going down these roads?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on that, obviously, but yeah, there's interest that could be, in the end, if we could also show that a more sustainable way of life is also a more economically sustainable way of life. That could help win the day. The difficulty I see, though, is to get to that point requires enough people willing to make sacrifices here and now, and are we willing to make those kind of sacrifices? You know, I mean, Jesus did die on the cross, and he paid a price. And so I'm not saying we all have to, we'd be ideal if we didn't have to have people die on crosses, obviously, to get there. But sometimes it's difficult for one generation. Well, think of people in Ukraine right now, where in order to save that nation, there are people making some amazing sacrifices there. And whatever you think about it, I'm just saying sacrifices are necessary if your goal is to save that nation. But who's going to benefit from that in the long run? They may have some sense of honor about sacrificing their lives now, but a lot of people here are going to pay a heavy price in order for Ukraine to continue to be a nation in the future. Yeah.
I think we can learn a lot from indigenous peoples and how they view.
I'm going to start coming around here and make sure we get these, because I want to get this stuff recorded if you're willing.
I think we need to look at how indigenous peoples look at the earth and earth's creatures, and they really see all of that, whether it's the trees or the shrubs or the creatures, as equal. And when they use things from the earth, they give thanks. And to me, that says something about how much they believe this earth is valued.
I don't want to, this is an issue for a table talk, but even when we talk about whose land this is and we've stolen it, interesting, I'm not sure we've stolen it, we've just looked at it the wrong way, because the indigenous people that have had the most impact on me are the ones, they don't even view it as we own the land. They don't even think in those terms. And so in some sense, that way of thinking is what we need too, where we're entrusted, we use it, and along the lines of what you're talking about. All right, let me just finish up here, and then I want to have at least a few minutes for some more comments. So the church's primary ecological responsibility, like what are we as a church? We're citizens also, so there's responsibility as citizens, but as a church, in responding to a government that is not fulfilling its ecological responsibility, church needs to be fearless in naming ecological sin. We're not necessarily experts in all this, but when we see sin, we name it, aiding victims of ecological degradation, and if necessary, engaging in direct political action. And James Hansen in his book gets to the point where he says, we may have to go into the streets on this. And we have had some examples of this. Greta Thunberg from Sweden, of course, and you had kids just getting out of school even. We've had a couple of occasions. It's been a while because of the pandemic, but we had them literally getting out of school for a day and just to because to bring that issue to attention. If anybody's ever heard her speak she's about as direct as they come when she speaks to whoever she's speaking to. She's not intimidated by world leaders. And then partner with a variety of people and organizations. And Luann, you brought up Clean Water Services. That's an example of partnering here in a more local way on something like that. It's important we don't lose sight of our primary task through all this, which is to proclaim in word and deed God's deep love for our earth home and all its inhabitants. This is grounded right, you can go back to Genesis. I mean, this is grounded there. We need to, God's love, we believe, is powerful enough to motivate change in our way of life, and when people truly take it to heart. The ecological agenda would be to convert people to this deep love of our earth home. The church as church has no special expertise in scientific, political, economic, and such issues. There are people who are part of our churches who have studied and have expertise. So that's the case. But it's not because we're the church that we're the experts on all of this now. No, that would we need to partner more widely than just thinking, well, we know because we're the church. Core ministry initiatives, our worship and Christian education. So how is Earth Care and all of that shaping how we worship and engage in Christian education? The third great commandment, this is something I talk about. In effect, you could get love of the earth under love of neighbor, just having a broader understanding of neighbor. I just think in our time to highlight the importance of the creation and that it's helpful to have a third great commandment, the love of creation. I also think we need to talk about, love of self is so much a part of you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is a healthy love of self that's part of all this too, and that's what I was trying to get at a little earlier. Many leading scientists have expressed a need for religious communities to motivate people. So the scientists say, we've got the expertise, we know what's going on here, but the whole, how do you motivate people to engage in things, that's where they've looked for help to the religious community. And even E.O. Wilson, who now has died, but he was a retired biologist from Harvard, raised as a Baptist, kind of left the Baptist church behind for a variety of reasons. But even he was part of that effort. He said, we need the help of religious leaders and religious communities in motivating people. Key insight, God did not send Jesus first and foremost to make Christians. This could sound like heresy. God sent Jesus to cultivate in human beings a deep love of God, neighbor, self, and creation. That's why Jesus was sent. In other words, so that we could all be who we are created to be. Final appeal. Let's see. I guess I will. Are there any questions first? I'll read something last. Or questions or comments anybody has?
I think as we look at climate change and recognizing that Jesus was sent to cultivate human beings in deep love of God, neighbor, self, and creation, that justice is an issue. And with climate change, those people who are least able to weather it are being the most affected.
Very good point. Classic definition of justice is to each his or her due. That doesn't quite work these days, but it's the whole idea is justice is what our people do, what our other creatures do, and it's how do we discern that and act. Yeah, DUE, yeah, DUE, exactly. Any other comments or questions? Larry.
I would also say to encourage study and research in applied physics for a new energy source.
So we want to use, and that's, human beings should be using all our creative powers here too. So we want to use all our abilities and not, there's no magic solution, so to speak, that's just going to do it on its own. It's going to take a real comprehensive, that's why I hate to use war images, but that's why I used World War II. Literally the whole nation needed to gear up in order to defeat Hitler and stop what was going on there. All right, any others? Okay, let me read the final thing here. I love where was I where I had to say what my favorite animal is, and it's not surprising, it's a salmon. So here's the final appeal in the book. As human beings, we have been a prodigal species. We have squandered our earth home inheritance. We have imposed ecological exile upon ourselves, and we and the whole earth community are paying the price. But like the father in the parable of the prodigal son, God is eager to welcome us home. God grieves what we have done to degrade our earth home. Nonetheless, God has not stopped loving us in our earth home. It's time to come to our senses. However, it will not be enough simply to come to our senses. Our whole selves need to be converted so that we can come home to earth. In the process of coming home, bold, decisive action will need to be taken. We may make some mistakes along the way. God has given us the freedom to act without fear of making mistakes. Without this freedom, we could be too cautious, afraid to make radical changes in our way of life. It would be easy to succumb to a disheartening passivity or hopeless cynicism. Followers of Jesus, filled with the hope of the resurrection, will not give up on our earth home. They will not yield to cynicism. They will not walk by on the other side of suffering earth. And then I'm going to move a little further on to share in the suffering of God, which is something that Bonhoeffer developed. The concept of sharing in the suffering of God includes sharing in the suffering of earth and all of its creatures. God loves earth too deeply to give up on it. God does not need cynics. God needs resolute people of faith who care so much for our earth home that even when hope is dead, they will not write it off. Instead, they will hope by faith and continue to invest themselves deeply in the well-being of the earth community. Like the salmon, they will expend every last ounce of energy they can muster for the purpose for which God created them. They will not rest until their journey home to earth is complete. God needs these resolute people of faith now. Amen. Thank you. All right. Well, thanks for being part of the class and whatever parts you could. There are some, if by any chance you want outlines from previous things, they're here. But next week then will be 9:30 is the worship service, but at 11 o'clock to 12:30 we'll in this room, and really to look at what's on the horizon for 2023 and beyond for St. Andrew and people of St. Andrew, and it'll be the culmination of a lot of the input that this Horizon team's been gathering from here, from people of St. Andrew and anyone who has been willing to share their views on that. So I encourage you to come and participate next week in that. And then after that, India is going to have a class on the diaconate. If you have any curious, where's leadership in the church and that kind of thing, she'll be doing that. She won't start until the 13th. Kyler is going to tackle the Apostles' Creed. So you have somebody out of the Church of God tradition who's come into the evangelical Lutheran tradition where we have these confessions and written documents and all that, and the Apostles' Creed is one of them. And he's just saying, well, what about this Apostles' Creed? Do we have to swallow it whole, is the big question he's raising. So I think it could be pretty interesting, and I think it'll be a good follow-up on the table talk we'll be doing this Thursday also, where we're looking at the language of worship and whether it's welcoming, unwelcoming, what changes we make, and we have been stirring up some conversation about those issues here in the last few months, so it could be an interesting table talk, 7 on Thursday. Go in peace, serve the Lord.